I've the great pleasure of talking to you now about a very different sort of aspect of the research that's been carried out in relation to this first stage of HyDeploy. So alongside the technical sort of research and the trial, we've also been carrying out social research into the customer perceptions of receiving the hydrogen blended gas in the homes with a number of colleagues of mine at different institutions as well. Next slide, please. So the overall aim of the research that we were carrying out was to explore the perceptions of the customers who are taking part in the HyDeploy pilot. So our research is a two-stage process, and I'm just going to present on the first stage, which was trying to understand sort of the customers' perceptions about the project before the blending started. And a bit later on in the summer, we'll be collecting a second phase of data with our residents. Now, the reason that we've carried out this research alongside the sort of technical project is because clearly, social acceptance is a key part of our technical energy transition. And this trial here at Kiel is our first opportunity to understand the perceptions of people who are actually going to or are experiencing hydrogen in the home. So there's been some other research, so I highlight the research there from Newcastle University, looking at the general public's sort of perceptions about hydrogen and how it can be used in the home. But here at Kiel, it's a different set of people who know when we spoke to them first, they knew they were about to receive hydrogen in the home. And so an additional sort of important stage of research into people's perceptions of hydrogen. Next slide, please. So the methodology that we approached was a qualitative one, and that allows us to develop much greater depth of understanding of the experience and the perceptions of our residents. We carried out 16 interviews in total in June, and we carried out sort of those interviews until we weren't getting anything new from those interviews. And the interviews were mostly sort of framed around, what people felt about taking part in the trial. And we were trying to see what would emerge from those sort of quite general questions. Next slide, please. So the sample that we were working with was actually quite mixed in terms of the gender of the participants, the housing tenure, whether houses were under private ownership or rented, quite a variation in the age of participants, and also the length of time that people had been in the property. Now, the residents on the Kiel campus are and the participants that we spoke to are largely Kiel employees, but some people we spoke to are partners of employees or former employees. Next slide, please. So I'll just cover sort of three key areas that emerged from our interviews with the residents. So firstly, thinking about what did people think about taking part in the demonstration in general. Then we'll look in a bit more detail about some of the concerns that arose, but also where they found reassurance, and some notes around the communication process. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing then is what did people think about taking part in the demonstration? Next slide. So in general, there were very positive views about taking part. The majority of the participants, they were supportive of being part of the demonstration project. And this was more than just sort of acceptance. There was actually real sort of positive support for what was being done. I've added into the slides the quotes, or some of the quotes from our interviews, to give you a flavour of the language that the residents and the participants were using. Beyond sort of that actually quite positive support that we were finding from the majority of our residents we spoke to, some also expressed a real genuine excitement about being part of the trial. And so, that quotation, just excited, I was as excited as you can be about hydrogen gas. So that potential then for actually real positive support that goes beyond just the acceptance that sometimes we might be looking for in trials. Next slide, please. Now, two areas that were positively received by the residents were the environmental benefits of the project, and they sort of saw that as a real sort of rationale, and also they really appreciated the fact that there was absolutely minimal disruption other than those initial safety checks which were carried out as part of this first trial, but also the fact that they didn't have to do anything in order to contribute something positive. So they sort of felt a halo effect from being part of the project. Next slide, please. Now, in line actually with the previous research that's been carried out with the general public, even though these residents had had significant communication and opportunity to discuss the project, there was little real technical or scientific understanding demonstrated from the interviews. And people were really happy to accept the sort of environmental benefits without really needing to understand much more about the technical, the scientific aspects of it. Next slide, please. Now, having said, that when we came to do the interviews in June, that almost everyone we spoke to was really very positive about the trial, and no one said that they wished that they hadn't been part of it. But there clearly had been some areas of initial anxiety felt by the residents, and that's maybe unsurprising. So, but even though there were these areas of anxiety, and I'll go on to look at those in a bit more detail shortly, it's important to say that this largely died away, decreased over time. And so by the time that the trial had actually started, the blending had started, any of that initial anxiety had largely died away. Next slide, please. So hopefully this next slide will start to take us on to the concerns that were initially experienced by some of the residents. So I'm not sure if you are able to move that slide on. If not, I'll just carry on talking a bit about some of those areas of concern. So the thing that came out most strongly was a concern around safety and an association being made between hydrogen and its sort of potential explosive nature. And again, this mirrors the sorts of things that has come out with research with the wider public. Another area that came up from the study in terms of their areas of some concern was around cost. And again, from the studies which have been carried out with the wider public, cost, a concern about sort of cost has come out very sort of strongly. And the costs was something which was picked up on by some residents, thinking this might be an issue sort of going forward, but it wasn't something that came out as strongly in the language that they were using about how they felt about the trial as their safety sort of concerns had been. Not sure if you can move the slides on. I'm still not seeing anything other than point 1.4, but I'll carry on regardless. So some of the other areas of concerns that were raised were some people weren't quite sure what the trial was sort of about, and so there was a sense that they were being asked to be part of a trial. It couldn't be deployed everywhere. So does that mean that it's safe? And then the other sort of area was a few residents were really sort of reflecting on, they felt that they'd been forced into being part of a trial. They hadn't had the opportunity to opt opt out. They didn't necessarily sort of want not to have been involved, but they wanted that opportunity. But obviously the important thing to sort of put here is that the nature of the trial, the nature of the gas network means that there isn't a logistical way for people to be able to opt out. And of course, the exemption that was that first stage sort of shows that the gas they will be receiving is as safe as what they've always received. Great. So I think if we can move on to the next slide now. So as we can see, there were some areas of initial concern, but people became that those concerns died away, and part of that was through different areas of reassurance. So the ability for one-to-one communication helped for some individuals, but also others expressing that they had a real implicit sort of trust. Of course, the project was going to be safe to have got to this stage. Next slide, please. So I've covered costs already, so if we can just sort of skip on from that and skip to the next one. Thank you. So if we just have a note about the communications then. So there was quite a detailed communication plan across lots of different sort of levels. So people were receiving communication in different forms and different levels, and that was important for different people. One thing that really came out of our conversations with people was that actually they had this sort of desire to continue to be told about what was happening in the project, even maybe from a project perspective. We didn't think there was much to tell them. They felt personally invested and wanted to hear sort of regular updates. And also that a number of people actually really valued the opportunity of taking part in the interviews, and it really helped them sort of feel a valued part of the whole sort of demonstration and trial process. Next slide, please. So just a quick note really about the university setting. So I think it's quite easy to dismiss the fact that the first stage took part in a university campus as the community being quite atypical and thinking, well, what can we learn from these? But it's actually quite a mixed community in many ways, and really not as scientifically literate as some others may expect from a university sort of campus, because we do have a whole range of people living on campus. But the university itself, is a great place as an at-scale living lab because of the private grid that's been mentioned, the fact that we have commercial and domestic uses. But we also now really have what I'd say demonstration-ready residents. So, I think there's great opportunities for the Kiel campus for future energy trials, potentially future hydrogen pilots, and potentially, further along that pathway to higher blends. So, in terms of the customer research, we still have another stage of research to carry out later on in the summer to see really how people's perceptions have changed over time, and also how they found the whole sort of process. Next slide, please. So just to highlight some of the lessons really that we can take away from this, in terms of the hydrogen blends in domestic properties, we really do need to acknowledge that safety concerns and cost concerns exist. And it might be that safety concerns are sort of more important for people who know that this is about to happen to them, their families, their houses. So that needs to be taken into consideration in communication. Environmental lack of disruption messaging is getting through and is effective, and people need lots of different forms of communication for their reassurance. In terms of pilots more generally, I think that the pride of being part of the project might be linked to some who sort of felt a pride of place, a pride for Kiel taking part in the pilot, the project. And so therefore there's an opportunity to link that. People have a pride in their own place, and that's a way of potentially sort of gaining that strong support for other projects in the future. I think it's important to maintain regular communication throughout the whole process, because people feel invested in a project, even though we might not think so. And actually really trying to ensure that we don't just view pilots as technical projects, because there's a lot to learn from customers, as well as them feeling a valued part of these demonstrations and pilots. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's all from me.
Okay, thanks very much, Zoe. That's brilliant, and thank you to Chris as well. Hopefully that's all given you a good insight into what's happening at Kiel. It is very important, you know, obviously we've got the technical side that's very important, but bringing people along with us on the network is no less important. So what I've got now is we've got a Q&A session, so I'm hoping that the slide will reappear imminently. And the Q&A session, so Zoe and Chris are gonna stay with us. We've also got Tommy, Nav from Progressive Energy. We've got Adam from Northern Gas Networks, Catherine from the HSE, and Jamie from ITM Power. So if I could encourage you, please, to submit any questions you have off the back of the presentations on the chat function. I'll look to pick them up. So we've been, we've basically had some questions submitted to us as part of the invite, so I'm going to run through those first. So the first question I've got is it has a technical slant to it. So it's I think for Catherine and Tommy, please. Are there any physical changes required on the network or in properties to accommodate the blend? So Tommy, I don't know if you want to lead off there, and then we'll hand over to Catherine.
Yeah, sure. So no physical changes have been required to enable the blend to be distributed and used. So this is across both the network assets, so the governor, for example, as well as the downstream appliances, including meters. So that position was reviewed by the HSE and deemed to be appropriate for the trial. To add some belts and braces, if you like, we undertook a incredibly robust monitoring regime of the entire chain of assets that would be exposed to the blend. So that's all the way from the initial injection point right the way through to the end appliances, where there's been very regular testing of both the installations and the appliances themselves to provide confirmatory evidence that no changes would be required to allow the blend to be safely distributed and used.
Okay, thank you very much.
Andy?
Catherine, yep.
No problem. So yeah, just very briefly, the principle of the whole trial was that essentially the infrastructure on the network would stay the same. And as Tommy says, we did testing of all components critical to performance, including appliances, just to demonstrate that. And the demonstration was made in terms of evidence to show that essentially all those components and appliances continued to work on blended gas.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And a couple of people asked, what influenced the choice of 20%, and what is the prospect for increasing the blend further, e.g. to 30%? So I think for Catherine and Tommy again, please. So Catherine, I don't know if you want to kick off on this one.
Yep, no problem. So the principle of 20% was set by some previous research, which actually HSE had done several years ago. And that was the target, and it's a target that's actually talked about across Europe as well. I mean, that's not saying you couldn't go above 20% over time, but certainly the demonstration at the moment has been made to 20%. There's been some testing of appliances that took them above 20% to demonstrate essentially a factor of safety. But the demonstration at the moment is to 20%, and the blending at Kiel has been up to that limit.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. Tommy, I don't know if you've got any additional points there, or Catherine's covered it.
No, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. Another question. Have you fully demonstrated that hydrogen blend is safe to distribute to customers? Catherine, I think that's probably one for you there.
Probably best for me, yes. So yeah. I think the principle of safety under the GSMR regulations was set out by Chris. So there's a specification in the GSMR regulations which dictates the quality of gas essentially that we receive in our homes at the moment. And by adding hydrogen, we were going outside of that specification, and the GSMR regulations which govern gas distribution required then a demonstration that we weren't prejudicing health and safety. And similar to other projects which have looked at going outside this specification, so as Chris talked about, biomethane or opening up the gas market, the requirement then was to look at and identify essentially all those aspects which might change when we added hydrogen, and to make a demonstration against all those aspects that might change, that you continue to maintain the same level of safety. So that was done. It was broken down into a number of technical areas, so through from appliances, procedures, gas detection, and various other areas. That demonstration was made against each of those areas, and also summarised in a quantified risk assessment. And that was put forward for assessment under GSMR to the HSE, and the safety case was then updated to reflect that. So that's the process that we went through to demonstrate safety.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And it's quite an interesting question here. So will skill sets need to differ within the supply chain? I know we've certainly got a very diverse skill set within the consortium. So Adam and Jamie, we'll start with Adam and from NGN. Would you like to answer that question, please?
Yeah, no problem, Andy. I mean, I think from a GDN perspective, what's been interesting from the project at Kiel and from a blending aspect of hydrogen is that broadly we haven't really had to change a great deal with the way that we've been operating at Kiel. I think the main point that we discovered early on in the project is that the current gas detection equipment that the GDNs use is cross-sensitive to hydrogen. And basically what happens with our current units is that the CO alarm in them will go off if there's hydrogen in the gas stream. So obviously that would give us false readings if we were operating on a blended network. So a pragmatic approach for the project to overcome that in the short term was to use two different detectors, one that would monitor CO and the other that would monitor the flammable gas ranges. So from a short-term approach, that's worked fine for Kiel, but it's fair to say that the industry is moving with us with this on this aspect, and there are gas instrument manufacturers that are developing equipment that can cope with a blend, and also I'm aware of others that are looking from 0 to 100% hydrogen as well. So in the short term, from a blend, there hasn't been a material change to the way they operate. Gas operatives will go and respond to a leak as they do now, but just with different equipment.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Adam. Yeah, that's good points. I mean, just to say that by doing a project like we're doing is really bringing the supply chain along with us, and we're certainly seeing lots of developments based on hydrogen actually being injected into a gas grid. So that's from Adam, who's obviously from a gas distribution network point of view. But Jamie, have you got anything from a sort of equipment SME point of view?
Yeah, hi there. I agree with Adam and Andy in regard to I think that the skill sets are pretty much already there. It's utilising the people within the consortium to prove that it can work, which I think we've very much done. I think with ITM working with the natural gas people in that natural gas arena, it's been a highly educational process for us as a company, and I think it can only help for the future. So I think that we're ready to scale, and we've proved that it is scalable. So I agree with Adam saying that it's just learning, and it's going on, and it's taking everyone else with us.
Okay, thanks very much. And we've got some strategic questions as well, but I'm conscious that we're getting plenty of questions on the chat function as well, but I think we can clear some up with what's previously been submitted to us. So the first question we've got here is on 100% hydrogen, and how will the UK transition from blending? And that's quite a popular question there. So Adam, I'm very conscious that NGN obviously leading on the H21 program. So have you got any comments about how we're going to transition from blending at 20% all the way up to 100% hydrogen?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, I think Chris touched it on the slides as we went through it. I think the real benefit with operating HyDeploy and a blend of 20% is that we're using this as a stepping stone for us to move forward to develop deeper savings in carbon reductions through 100% hydrogen gas networks. I think the one thing that's critical to that is that we obviously need to develop the evidence to move forward with that, and that's around the safety, which is what we've done at Kiel and with HyDeploy. Until we know that the networks can operate safely, then we can't make that next step change, and that's what the H21 program, which is a collaborative project with all the other GDNs, is working towards, is to first of all prove that safety aspect, and then start delivering the operational side of it with regards to how we respond to gas leaks, because that's a bigger step change from 20% hydrogen to 100% hydrogen. And there's also work going on from in government with the High for Heat program, which is looking at downstream in the meter of 100%. So the networks work up to the meter, and then from the internal side of a customer's property is being looked at for a government High for Heat program. So there is a roadmap that's being built towards 100% hydrogen, because to meet our climate change targets of being carbon neutral by 2050, we really need to do something more drastic than operating a blend. But we see that a blend is that real stepping stone where we're building perceptions from customers, and we're also developing that supply chain and production of hydrogen to move forward to that 100% vision.
Okay, thanks, Adam. And we've got another question here about how does HyDeploy project linked with industrial clusters such as HyNet? So I'll start answering this question, then I may hand over to Chris to add any additional points he's got. The aspiration of HyNet is by the mid-2020s that we're looking to distribute a hydrogen blend to a large portion of customers, so up to 2 million customers on our northwest network. And obviously to do that, we need HyDeploy to be successful, and that's up to 20% volume level. And Cadent is just undertaking a large body of work at the moment to build out a hydrogen distribution pipe that we can fund through our Rio GD2 price control to actually build that hydrogen pipeline and have the necessary infrastructure in place to decarbonise heavy industry and then put a blend into our network. So good progress is starting to be made there. We're hoping that we're going to receive feed funding later on in the year, which will allow us to take that next step and head towards final investment decision. So yeah, HyDeploy does heavily link with HyNet in particular. And Chris, as progressively leading the HyNet programme, I don't know if you've got any additional points to add there.
Sure, thank you, Andy. No, that's great. And I'll just pick up some of the questions on the chat as well. There's lots of good questions out there. So one was relating to scale, and this is quite a useful one to pick that up. So at Kiel, someone asked, how many kilograms of hydrogen can we produce a day? Well, it's about 200 kilograms of hydrogen a day from our electrolyser. So that is an electrolyser that's rated at 0.5 megawatt electrical input. When we're talking at, which produces around 350 kilowatts of hydrogen, when we're talking on HyNet, the first line is 1,000 times bigger than that. Okay, but we see, and particularly with that distribution system Andy has just talked about, HyNet provides a spine for both bulk production, and in that case it's also thermal reformation of gas with carbon capture and storage, linked to other sources of hydrogen, so use of electrolysis with green hydrogen being able to patch into that as well. I think it is fair to say that we can get to scale larger and faster using those bulk sources, which then helps enable the build out of the infrastructure, so that then all those types of hydrogen can play their part. And as we roll forward to 2050, I'm sure we will see an increasing proportion of that coming from green alongside blue hydrogen. So I think that's really important. In terms of scale, well, scale will really depend on individual contexts. Where you don't have carbon capture and storage infrastructure, then I'm sure you're going to be using sort of green hydrogen sources, and probably at smaller scale. And then that links into cost, and maybe we're going to have some cost questions that we can cost and policy questions that we want to pick up now as well. Do you want me to pick that up, Andy, the policies and costs? I think Andy, you're on mute.
Apologies, yeah, on mute.
Yeah.
I was going to start from a project point of view and just describe how we go about charging customers basically for their gas when they have a hydrogen blend in the network, and how we've sort of overcome that for the trial. So Chris, I don't know if you want to lead off on that point.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll start with that, and then we'll just try and move to what we need ultimately. So yeah, we've been very clear on the trial at Kiel that none of our customers are paying for the hydrogen they receive. So effectively, they are receiving energy for an element of their energy from free. So they'll actually see a reduction in cost, and we see that as appropriate because they're part of us on that journey with us. Clearly, over time, we will need to work out a way of charging people appropriately for the energy that they use, and that's a wider challenge that the gas industry is looking to address with various projects going on, whether it's the future billing methodology project and others looking at that. But it does come down to this fundamental question that saving carbon does, until we fully internalize the cost of carbon in the energy we use, will tend to be more expensive to be using a low carbon solution until the price of carbon gets to the point where there is a parity and an ability to make those decisions. So what we do need is a way of addressing that, and we need a just way of distributing those costs. And I know government is working very hard at the moment on policies to support hydrogen production. So there's an expert group formed by BEIS, which is looking into exactly what the business models for hydrogen production are, how those who produce hydrogen are supported, and that will obviously also include how do those costs fall in a way that is just and fair. But also we'll need to make sure that end users wish to use that low carbon solution, and there will need to be the appropriate policy mechanisms out on the network to encourage, whether it be suppliers, whether it be gas distributors, or whether it's customers, to be able to use those low carbon gases. But government is working on those policies. What we need them to do so is to press on with that urgently. Again, we've seen on the chat lots of questions of why is it going to take us so long to get to this point? We are driving as fast as we can. We are looking that we will be putting the exemption together for the HyNet Northwest over a time frame, which means that we could be blending at scale within 5 years. That's what we're looking to be able to achieve. To do that, we need those policy regimes being locked in by government to enable us to do that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. There's an interesting conversation on the chat about perceptions that I'm going to point in Zoe's direction. So was there any communication to customers that carrying on with natural gas isn't an option? Consumer choice will be limited in the future, accepting a green gas or get a different heating system. So Zoe, I'm not sure if you've got any further thoughts around that, about, staying as we are today really isn't an option.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. I mean, it might be that there are other people in the project team who can say a bit more about the exact communication sort of messaging. But what was sort of clear was that the environmental sort of messaging, the environmental sort of benefits were something that people were very sort of supportive of. And when we carried out our research with the residents, it was in June, a time where climate change, very high on the media sort of agenda, and so there was a lot of sort of interest, and I think sort of those connections sort of are being made. And I think sort of linking back to some of Chris's sort of earlier points about that sort of transition, that there clearly is sort of work that needs to be done around sort of the transition in people's sort of perceptions, so that we create sort of a public who are really ready for these energy transitions that we're going to be faced. And clearly, the decarbonisation message, the fact that we can't carry on as usual, is really critical to that, and is certainly one that, from our research, is being positively received.
Thanks very much, Zoe. And I'm not entirely sure who to ask this question of, but it's a very interesting question. It's about the opportunity that C19 potentially gives us. So obviously the question is, obviously this is a very new technology that will take a while to develop, but is there anything can be done in the short term or short to medium term with HyDeploy and the UK, the wider hydrogen sector in the UK to unlock the UK's hydrogen economy. So, yeah, I think we potentially have got an opportunity here with coronavirus. And Chris, I mean, would you like to start us off on that, and then I'll offer it up to the remainder of the team?
Sure, absolutely. So we've seen from Lord Deben a couple of weeks ago put forward the case very strongly that as we emerge from C19, we need to be rebuilding our infrastructure. It's a great way of getting the economy going. And in that letter that he wrote to Boris Johnson, he explicitly included hydrogen as one of the elements that we need. And we do see hydrogen here. We're focused on blending into the gas network, which is absolutely important. But the key thing about hydrogen is it unlocks so many different parts of our energy system, whether it's for transportation. Someone on the chat said, you know, why haven't you used a fuel cell on your network? Well, great, that would be a lovely thing to do. We have been focused on the core question here. The core research question is, can we demonstrate it as safe as a blend? That's great. I know that Kiel would love to continue to have hydrogen on its site and do further research, but you can do transport, you can do industrials and how to support our industrials as they're facing quite big challenges at the moment, not just because of C19, but because of their carbon emissions, whether it's dispatchable power. Hydrogen plays a role in all these parts. And so, yes, I think it does form a part of that recovery. Probably the logical place for that is the starting point of supporting the production of hydrogen, because there are all these markets. That's most likely to lead to kind of investment on the ground sooner rather than later. We're pushing forward on this large scale hydrogen production plant. I'm sure Jamie at ITM would love to see multiple units being put down of electrolyzers. Maybe that's a good place to start, given we have that range of potential users in all those sectors. And as we get the permissions and ultimately, hopefully, a full change of the specification under GSMR or in an associated standard that allows ubiquitous use of hydrogen as a blend, we can be doing that as well. So I think it's got a key role to play.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think we're down to our final question now with regards to time. This is one, I think, for Tommy and potentially Nav as well. So it's a question. So I believe this is purely focused in the domestic market at the moment. So are commercial boilers and burner manufacturers working on producing hydrogen to their products? So Tommy, do you want to give us quite a quick answer, please?
Sure, I will try and be brief. So our focus of the presentation has so far been on the domestic side of things. It is worth noting that at Kiel, although we have focused on the 100 homes, those 30 university buildings are actually where the majority of the gas is being used. So around 80% of the gas is being used for non-domestic purposes, where we are blending into boilers up to 600 kilowatts, commercial catering equipment. Now, the basis of our appliance research has extended from just domestic appliances through to commercial appliances to create a general evidence base. But it is a fair observation to say that we have been domestically focused up to this point, but we absolutely recognise that the technical evidence base required for rollout extends beyond those users, and we are actively involved in programmes for commercial and industrial evidence. For example, we are coordinating a series of industrial trials with furnaces up to 55 megawatts. So quite a substantial load. And going forward, those other non-domestic areas will become an increasing priority of the programme.
Okay, thank you very much. And so firstly, thank you to Chris and to Zoe for their presentations. And then thank you very much for the panel members for answering the questions posed to them. It's worth pointing that I didn't get through all the questions. Well, I didn't get through nearly all the questions. So if you would, if you have a particularly burning question, please feel free to submit it on our website and we will get back to you. So finally, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining the webinar. I hope you found it useful and informative. And on behalf of the panel and the consortium, I hope that you're all looking well, or keeping well, sorry. and looking well. And that we hope obviously C19 restrictions will be lifted soon enough that we can actually start to bring people to the Kiel site. Okay, thank you very much, and hope you have a good remainder of the day. Goodbye.